Hello, class, and welcome to Econ, Monday, March 25th. This will be a video presentation, but it'll be pretty much like what we do every time we have class. We'll start today with current events. Then we'll do a review of the chapter, kind of go over terminology and any other pertinent information. At that point in time, you guys will have time to work on your virtual stock market. I do ask that you send me a screenshot via email of your portfolio to get attendance for today's class. After we're done with the virtual stock market, Cody will hand out the in-class quiz. You're to work on that as a group. When you've completed the quiz, go ahead and hold on to that to use as a study guide for this week's self-assessment. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that you can see part of what we're doing today. Let's see. All right, so I'm going to start us at the beginning. All right, so we're currently working on Chapter 3, Economics, Supply and Demand Curve. If you have not read this chapter, you need to go back and read the chapter pretty much word for word. I also am going to say this several times during the lecture today, but I would go through as you're reading the chapter and I would draw out the supply and demand curves, with each new concept that's introduced throughout the chapter. So not only do you need to read it, but you probably want to illustrate the different curves. This is probably the most important chapter that we're going to cover in economics, and it's really the foundation of everything we talk about moving forward. So if you don't understand the supply and demand curve, you're going to have a hard time understanding the concepts that are coming up. So again, this is one that you really want to pay attention to. You really want to read. Maybe read the chapter twice. I've read it twice, and go through and just understand the concepts and be able to illustrate what they're talking about. So let's get started. Current events. So this, I'm kind of leaving it up to you guys to make sure that you have a discussion with each other. I'm not going to hold you to it. I'm going to trust that you're doing it. But my current event for the week is the NCAA March Madness tournament. From an economic standpoint, it's pretty outstanding. Some of the figures that have been thrown around is that the city of Dayton, Ohio, who hosts like one of the regional conferences or one of the, I guess it's the first four that they host each year. Those are the teams that are on the bubble that haven't made it in yet. Just by hosting that, they've seen an increase of $66 million pour into their economy over the last several years. Providence, Rhode Island, which will host a tournament, 3.5 million. Philadelphia, 18 million. One of the big numbers out there is Houston, who this year, by hosting the Final Four, could generate upwards of $300 million for their economy. So that's a huge bunch of money for hosting the basketball event. And these are usually hosted at like major sports venues once you get to the Final Four. So they have to be able to kind of juggle that schedule. But to make that much money, $300 million for hosting a Final Four event, and also they get to show off their city, which will bring tourists and more money into that economy. So that was my current event for the week. If you guys have any current events, please feel free to add those and discuss those. So now let's talk about the demand curve. Okay, this is where we're going to start the chapter. It's where the chapter kind of begins. A couple things to understand. Okay, the demand curve, anytime you're drawing a demand curve or a supply curve or both of them, you're going to have price on the vertical axis and you're going to have quantity on the horizontal axis. So that's one thing you always have to keep in mind. You always have to have these axes correctly set up. So price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. The other unique thing about a demand curve is generally, in most cases, it's going to slope downward. There are some exceptions to that we'll discuss in later chapters, but it pretty much always slopes downward. So the way a demand curve works is we've got our price and we've got our quantities down here. And then basically these are probably in millions of gallons, and this is cost per gallon. So what we can see is that at $1 a gallon, they're going to sell 800 million gallons of gasoline. But at $2.20 per gallon, they're only going to sell around 400 million gallons of gasoline. So one of the things economics deals with is what happens in between these 2 points that would cause the price to go up or down, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So supply curve. So our next curve is the supply curve. It's the producers. The first one was the consumers, what they were willing to pay per gallon. This is the supply curve. This is what producers are willing to sell per gallon. So again, at $1, the producers are willing to put out about 500 million gallons of gasoline. At $2.20, they're up almost to 700 million gallons of gasoline. So, what are all the different factors that might shift the price back and forth in these particular areas? So we're going to talk about that a little bit further. Now, when we mix the two curves, we have our supply and demand curve here. The point at which they cross is the perfect price. It's the perfect quantity supplied. This is called equilibrium. It's very rare that you hit equilibrium because, as we know, there are so many factors in the economy that can change what's going on, that these two curves will shift backwards and forwards, and we'll see that in a minute. But at $1.40 per gallon, the perfect amount of gas to be produced is 600 million gallons. So that's where we hit equilibrium. That's where the demand curve and the supply curve cross each other. Anything above that, if all is equal, everything above that is considered to be a surplus. Anything below that would be considered a shortage. So what would happen is we're supplying 700 million gallons of gasoline at $1.20. Well, the thing is that people are going to want to buy a lot of gasoline, but there's going to be a shortage of gas, and just the opposite for a surplus. So if you get up to $1.80, the consumers are only going to buy so much gasoline. If you're charging $1.80, you're going to have leftover gasoline that you're not able to sell. So, and again, these are all concepts that if you're drawing these out and you're putting your numbers on there and you're putting the equilibrium and you're kind of marking out the prices and these different points like you see in this diagram, you'll start to understand how these curves work. So we talked a little bit earlier about shifts in demand. So what can happen at some point in time, economic factors can force the demand curve to shift forwards or backwards. But one thing I want you to notice real quickly is that the curve itself doesn't change. Okay, it's the same shape in all three of these. So our middle one is our equilibrium. This is like normal state. And this particular graph is showing millions of cars sold at a different price. So we've got at the perfect equilibrium price and quantity, we've got 18 million cars being sold at $20,000. This is probably a particular type of car, and they'll sell 18 million units of these. Now, let's say that the cost of steel goes up. So the cost of steel goes up, so the cost of producing a car goes up. Well, that factor doesn't have anything to do with price. It has the fact to do with the cost of producing the car. So what happens is that our whole demand curve will actually shift to the left. It'll actually come back this way. Why? Because the price of producing the car went up, and we can still sell the car at $20,000, but with the increase in steel, the suppliers are only going to be able to produce 14.4 million to make it profitable to sell those. They're going to probably start producing some other car or doing some alternative to help make up the difference because of the increase in steel. And then you have the exact opposite if the price of steel decreases. So now the price of steel has come down, the demand curve shifts to the right. Now all of a sudden you're selling 20 million cars at $20,000 a piece, okay? So you're actually able to produce more because the cost of production has gone down, which shifts that demand curve to the right. This also has to do with income. So let's say that for whatever reason, the income of the average American goes up. Well, now all of a sudden, Americans are more willing to purchase a car at $20,000. So therefore, the producers are going to offer more cars. Now, if our income goes down, that's going to shift the demand curve backwards. And now, because we're making less money, there's just fewer of us to purchase the car. So now they can only sell 14.4 units at $20,000. The income example is a better example. The steel example has actually more to do with the supply curve, so I'll use that again when we get to the supply reference. Okay, so factors that can change demand, and just always remember we have a demand and we have a supply curve. So what's going to shift demand are taste preferences. So one day we like something more than we like something else, therefore we're going to purchase that particular product because we like it more. And then when our taste kind of wears off, we're going to kind of shift backwards. This is probably seen a lot in the fast food industry, like Taco Bell will roll out a new Doritos taco, and all of a sudden we're like, oh, that's the greatest thing ever, so we're going to go out there and we're going to buy more of them. But over time, we kind of get tired of the Doritos taco, and then McDonald's launches some kind of new double cheeseburger with jalapenos, and we're like, oh, that's the greatest, latest new thing. So our demand's going to shift backwards for the taco and forwards for the jalapeno hamburger. And then also we talked about income. As income rises, we're more likely to buy goods, so that can shift the entire demand curve. When income decreases, that's going to shift it backwards. The price of substitutes rises or falls. So what a substitute is it's a product that that could be substituted for something we're purchasing. So we may substitute, you may take generic canned goods versus name brand canned goods. The generics can be substituted. So let's say substitutes are really inexpensive. Well, we might be more likely to purchase the substitutes, which would create an increase in demand for that particular substitute. But then all of a sudden, let's say that the generics, something happens to the generic, like maybe there's a food scare with generics, and all of a sudden that's going to shift the demand curve backwards, and we're going to go back to the regular brand goods at that point in time. So that's kind of what a substitute might happen in a substitute case. You have complements. These are, the book uses the example of golf balls and golf clubs. So as the demand for golf clubs increases, so does the demand for golf balls. The golf balls are a complement of the golf clubs. And then let's say that people just are taking up tennis instead of golf. There's been a lot of tennis on TV, and people are starting to relate more to tennis than golf. That could cause the demand for the golf clubs to drop backwards, which would also decrease the complementary product of the golf balls and make that shift backwards. Future expectations that encourage buying or discourage buying. This could be, say, your holiday pay. Let's say that your boss gives you a big bonus, and you know that bonus is coming at Christmas time, so you purchase more goods depending on that future expectation. And then say the opposite happens. Say you get laid off from work. That could discourage buying around the holiday times. So that would be a discouraging future expectation. All right, shifts in supply. So we talked earlier about the idea of steel. I'm going to use that example because that's actually a supply chain product for the automobile industry, and that's what the book uses, is the steel example. So if steel increases in price, producers are going to be producing less of that particular product because they know it's going to increase the price of the car. So you're going to see a shift backwards in the supply curve. So that's a factor that affects supply. If the price of steel decreases, you're going to see the supply curve move up because now we are able to produce more cars at a lower price, bringing down the price and allowing consumers to purchase more cars at the $20,000 price range. So that's kind of an idea of how you would see a shift in supply. Okay, factors that influence supply. Favorable natural conditions. This was interesting. There's a great example in the book talking about salmon fish. And there was a particular year when kind of all of the stars aligned for salmon in the fisheries. And these people, the water supply was greater in the rivers, so more salmon were able to swim upstream to breed. There were more nutrients in the water for the salmon to eat, so they were stronger. So that particular year, when all of the elements kind of aligned for a great salmon season, we saw a shift in the supply curve forward. So there were more salmon, there were more to catch, It shifts the supply curve, which puts more salmon on the market for the consumer to purchase. A fall in input prices, that's the example we used with steel. So if the price of steel goes down, it's cheaper to produce a car, you're going to produce more cars. Improved technology, the example that I used here is tablets versus laptops. So recently we've seen a surge in tablet technology, and so that particular surge could increase the demand for the supply of tablets, but also it could decrease the supply of laptops because more people are supplementing the tablets for laptops. And then lower taxes, lower changes in regulations, getting rid of regulations will cost the producer less, which will force that supply curve out. Just the opposite when we move backwards on the supply curve, poor natural conditions. So if you have a poor salmon season because the rivers are running dry, there's not as much food for the salmon to eat, that's going to shift that supply curve backwards. We already talked about technology for like laptops. If you see people replacing their laptops with tablets because tablet technologies become so much better, you're going to see that demand for laptops come backwards. There's going to supply fewer of them. Higher product taxes and more regulations, that cost the producer more. That'll shift that supply curve backwards. So there'll be fewer products to put out onto market. Okay. Now, it is important for you guys to go through these steps. These are kind of the steps to drawing equilibrium with the supply and the demand curves. So just go through this. This is in the book. Make sure that you understand. You need to draw the demand and supply model before any economic change takes place. So you're going to just draw the demand and supply curve at that point in time in history. And you can just set up your own examples of this. You can do this for anything that you want to do it. The supply and demand for apples, and you can just make up your own quantities, but just understand how the supply and demand curve works. And then let's say you did that for apples, and let's say that you have a drought one year. Well, draw where that supply curve might go if you have that drought. Or let's say that people's preference for apples increases because the apple industry runs a bunch of ads. So what happens to that demand curve? Where does that go? You want to draw that out and understand the factors that are moving those curves back and forth. And you need to just get a piece of paper out. Probably a pencil's better so that you can erase any mistakes and just go over and over different examples of sketching these out and understanding how they shift backwards and forwards. So that's kind of the 4-step process there. So now we have a combined shifts in supply and demand, and this is really how the real world works. Okay, again, we have price over here on this side, quantity on this side. It never changes. But one of the things that we notice when we have an example of a supply and demand shift, meaning both of them are shifting, in this case, what we see is this is the postal case. This is the post office case inside the book. And what happens is that we know over time we have regressed from actual sending letters to each other to sending emails and text and Twitter and Snapchat and Instagram and Pinterest and everything else that you can send information by. That's replaced the regular mail. So the quantity of mail being produced has decreased, okay? So those are economic factors that have decreased demand. Now, the supply curve, what's funny is that with less mail, you need fewer postal workers. So you don't need to supply as many postal workers. But one of the things about postal workers, like any other job, is you do have an increase in inflation every year. Sooner or later, you have to increase wages. So you have these two shifts going on. You have a change in technology, which creates less of a demand for postal services. You need fewer postal workers, so the supply of postal workers goes down, but they also will demand higher wages, so you see the price of postage go up. So it's a complicated example, but definitely go through and read it in the book and be able to sketch this out and come up with your own example. If you're able to do that, if you're able to kind of create this and come up with your own examples, then you're going to have a much greater understanding of a dual shift in supply and demand, or a combined shift in supply and demand. So, okay, the next concept we need to talk about with this chapter is a price ceiling. So what is a price ceiling? Well, a price ceiling is when generally like the government might step in and say, you can't charge any more for this product. The most typical example we see of this is rent control. And you generally see rent control in areas where there's just a shortage of apartments. So take Manhattan, for example. In Manhattan, you're dealing with a small, very condensed area, lots of apartments. A lot of wealthy people live there. But the problem is not everybody that works in Manhattan is wealthy, okay? So you may have people that work in the restaurant industry, or people that work for, different industries that supply services for Manhattan. And these may be just typical Joes just working, but the cost of an apartment in Manhattan is so outrageous, they can't live anywhere near the city. Well, the problem is that really for the wages they may have to live, 2 hours away from Manhattan. So they have a 4-hour or 6-hour drive each day to get to work to make, what's considered to be, the minimum wage in Manhattan. Not only can they not live in the city of Manhattan, they probably can't go out to lunch in the city of Manhattan. The other thing is it's very expensive. You can look this up, and this would be an interesting current event, but I'd be interested to see what the average parking rate is per day in Manhattan. I'd be willing to bet that the cheapest rate in Manhattan is probably the most expensive rate in downtown Denver. I'd say, I don't know, I'm going to say probably $50 to $75 a day to park your car in Manhattan would be the lowest price. Sounds crazy, but how is an average restaurant worker going to afford to park their car? And mass transit, that's not the cheapest either. So with all of that said, the government does provide rent-controlled housing in New York for people that want to work in these areas, and to be able to offer the services that people need in those particular areas. In that case, there is a ceiling for these particular apartments, and they're reserved for those particular people to be able to rent these apartments. And that's just kind of the idea of what a price ceiling is. A price floor is the opposite, okay? And we mainly see price floors in the agricultural industry. So farms, they're highly dependent on basically the conditions of the fields each year. And with the changes in weather, it's a highly volatile industry. And so what you'll see is the government will come in and put a floor in saying that you cannot charge less than this amount for a particular product, meaning that grocery stores, we're going to use milk as an example. Grocery stores may have a price floor for what they can purchase milk at. They may say, the government may say $1.50 a gallon is the lowest price that you can offer these farmers for their milk. And why is that? Because the funny thing about a price floor is you may have a giant surplus. So one year you might have a huge scarcity in milk, which you wouldn't need a floor for, because farmers are going to demand a much higher price because there's a lot less milk out there. But then you can have the opposite effect. You could have a great year for milk. The fields were wet and the grass was high and the cows were eating and there's just a ton of milk out there. But what would happen is that the farmers would keep knocking their price down because they're competing against each other, and they would get to a point where they can no longer sustain their farm. In that case, you might have a price floor, and that would help sustain the industry as a whole. So mainly price ceilings and price floors are there to protect not just the producers, but in some cases the consumers as well. You also have in any supply and demand curve, you have this idea of consumer and producer surplus. So at the equilibrium price, any price charged above that is going to create a consumer surplus, meaning that you have extra consumers out there that are unwilling to pay this higher price, and they're not going to pay the price until it hits the equilibrium price, which means you have extra consumers, you have a consumer surplus. The same thing as when you drop the price too low. So there's going to be some producers that are going to say, look, I'm not going to sell my goods at that price. It's not at the equilibrium price. So you actually have a producer surplus at that point in time. All right, so we're just going to go over terminology. I might skip past some of these that we already discussed. Again, I'm going to remind you to go through, read the chapters, understand the concepts. You want to know the terminology in case it's brought up in future chapters. Ceteris paribus, other things being equal. So we have ceteris paribus anytime we draw a demand and supply curve. It's a snapshot. Think of it as a moment in time, a snapshot of what's going on with a good or service. And then everything else being equal means that we're only dealing with price and quantity, everything else being equal at that point in time. Complements, we already talked about what complements were. These are golf balls and golf clubs or anything that goes along with something else. Consumer surplus, we talked about, it's the extra benefit consumers receive from buying a good or service measured by what individuals would have been willing to pay minus the amount they are actually paying. Deadweight loss, this is the loss of social surplus of all surplus that occurs when a market produces inefficient quantity. So in either case, you can have a deadweight loss. Deadweight loss, again, would be that the price is too high, so you have consumers unwilling to pay for the product. That's a loss in purchasing. You could have a surplus in goods at a lower price. That would be a loss of profit for the companies. That's a deadweight loss. All right, demand curve, we've gone over that. Demand schedule is basically a table of the figures that you're going to put along your demand curve. So you might have quantities and prices for a particular good that are going to show up as a good or service on your supply and demand curve. Demand, we know that the relationship between the price and quantity demanded for a certain good or service. Economic surplus is the same as social surplus. Equilibrium price, I hope we know what that is. That's that price where the supply and demand curve cross each other. Same thing with quantity. That's where the supply and curve, if you draw the line down to the quantity, that's the equilibrium quantity at the point where they cross. And then obviously equilibrium is where they cross. Excess demand at an existing price, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, also called a shortage. Excess supply at an existing price, quantity supply exceeds the quantity demanded, also called a surplus. Factors of production are going to be your labor, materials, and machinery that are used to produce the goods, services, and also it can be called inputs. An inferior good. So this is an interesting concept. Let's go back to generic food, for example. So if income's low, you're going to sell more generic food. But as income increases, people are going to be less likely to buy the generic food because they're going to consider it to be inferior. So that's an idea of inferior good. Inputs, we talked about that, the combination of labor, materials, machinery used to produce goods and services, also called factors of production. Law of demand, the common relationship that higher price leads to lower quantity demanded of a certain good or service and a lower price to a higher quantity demanded, while all other variables are held constant. Law of supply, the common relationship that higher price leads to greater quantity supplied. Get rid of that. And while all other variables are held constant. A normal good, this is just something that we use in our everyday lives. And it's also something that naturally goes up or down depending on demand or as income increases. A price ceiling, we talked about that. It's the maximum price that can be charged. It's usually regulated. A price control is a government law that regulates prices instead of letting market forces determine prices. A price floor is a legal minimum price. The price obviously is what buyers are willing to pay for a specific unit of a good or service. Producer surplus, we've talked about that. It's the extra benefit producers receive from selling a good or service measured by the price the producer actually receives minus the price the producer would have been willing to accept. Go back there. Quantity demanded, the total number of units and services consumers are willing to purchase at a given price. Quantity supplied, the number of units of goods and service producers are willing to sell at a given price. Shifts in demand. When a change in an economic factor other than price causes a different quantity to be demanded at every price. Shift in supply. When the change in the economic factor other than price causes different quantity to be supplied at every price. And we talked about those factors. If you need to go back and look at those, please feel free. Shortage at an existing price, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, also called excess demand. We talked about social surplus. This is the sum of both the consumer and producer surplus. So this is where you get dead weight loss. If for whatever reason you're selling a product or good or service above or below the equilibrium price, you're going to have this type of dead weight loss for either the consumer or producer within that curve. Substitute. Again, this is a good or service that could substitute, maybe, for example, for whatever reason, cars become extremely expensive, but pickups don't, and we're okay with driving pickups as opposed to cars, so we'll substitute the pickup for cars because the price difference is so great. Supply curve, it's a line that shows the relationship between price and quantity supplied on a graph, and quantity supplied at the horizontal axis, price of the vertical axis. We're almost through with these. Supply schedule, a table that shows a range of prices for a good and service and the quantity supplied at each price. That's this. It's basically the numerical equivalent of your supply and demand curve. So it's a table that shows those prices and quantities supplied. Supply, the relationship between price and quantity supplied for good or service. Surplus at an existing price, quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, also called excess supply, and total surplus is the same as social surplus. So that is the chapter in review. It is one of the biggest chapters we have in the book. And again, I'm not going to stress how important it is to go through, read that chapter once, if not twice, be able to draw each one of these supply and demand curves out, because you're going to use these particular references later on as we're going forward in the class. Okay, now it's time for the virtual stock market. What I need you to do for attendance today is I need you to go in there, do your buying and selling of stocks based on economic factors. So again, if we've seen some kind of increase or decrease of news about a particular company, you need to kind of decide, is that going to have a factor in whether or not that company's stock's going to go up or down? If you see, positive news about a company, you're probably going to see their stock start to trend upwards. Again, remember that certain industries are going to be more volatile than others. So if you see that a company is releasing a new drug, for example, that's been approved by the FDA, that's going to see a sharp increase in price. So that might be a stock that you want to buy. If you see bad news come out and you have that stock, you probably want to dump that company. If it seems like it's going to be short-term bad news, you probably want to keep an eye on that company and see if it washes over and then purchase that stock. So just keep that all in mind. But once you've gotten to that point, please screenshot your virtual portfolio, send it to me. I'll put you in for attendance for today's class. That's how you're going to get attendance today. And then last thing to cover today is the in-class quiz. So when you guys are ready, Cody will hand out the in-class quiz. This is for you guys to complete together as a group. I want you to keep the quiz and then use it for your weekly assessment. And that's all I have for you guys today. Have a great next couple of days. You will also see a recording like this for Wednesday as well. Thank you for joining, and that's it. Thank you.